Um, may I request Anandita to please take the chair? Anandita Mazumdar, as you all know, teaches sociology at the Manipal Center here. Her research engages with questions of reproductive rights, the nation state, and interpersonal relations in the context of commercial surrogacy and assisted reproductive technologies in India. She's previously taught at the University of Delhi and was recently awarded her doctoral degree by the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi. And it's a pleasure to reconnect with Anandita after, I don't know, 2 decades, almost 2 decades. So her paper is a fascinating paper on the conceptions of the mythic and assisted conception. 30 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for making it on a Sunday morning to listen to me talk about the bizarre world of assisted conception. This is actually, I have to thank Michael for this. It was one of the elements of my doctoral thesis which I didn't really explore, but I'm doing that right now. Also because I'm beginning research here on assisted conception at Manipal University, so this actually, it's in a work in progress stage, so please be kind. And I seek your comments and criticisms on this, but it helped me actually also think through how law, and actually look through and think through the category of the non-state actor. I mean, how are we conceptualizing the non-state actor? In this paper, while I was thinking through the use of myth to inform, to understand law, the non-state actor is not just one, but many, of course, and it's also something that I'm grappling with. But basically, what I'm doing in this paper is looking at the Indian Council of Medical Research Assisted Reproductive Technology Bill, which is meant to regulate the use of in vitro fertilization techniques and commercial surrogacy in India, or what is known in common parlance, renting a womb, problematic term, but it's a transnational industry. And the bill has been through various versions, various avatars, and recently what I'm actually invoking in this paper is the Indian Council of Medical Research Secretary R.S. Sharma, who's ubiquitous. He's on TV, he's in the newspaper. He actually represents the ICMR bill on assisted reproductive technologies. His recent lecture at Manipal University. So I use elements of his lecture and myth to understand how he kind of looks and sells assisted reproductive technologies. At the inauguration of a hospital in Mumbai in October 2014, the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, invoked Lord Ganesha and the infamous anti-hero Karna from the Mahabharata as products of ancient Indian expertise in plastic surgery and assisted reproduction, or genetic engineering, respectively. Op-eds and internet discussion groups marked this bizarre take on medicine and medical innovation, with commentators seeking to understand what PM Modi was actually invoking when he referred to Ganesha and Karna. One must remember that both plastic surgery and the genetic engineering ART's medicine in India are now emerging transnational industries that attract domestic and international clientele. Was this then a subtle way of saying we make in India way before others did? Or, and I speculate here, this was an attempt to bring forth a different form of legitimacy. The Indian Council of Medical Research Drafting Committee for the Assisted Reproductive Technologies Bill aims to bring forth similar paradoxes of the divine in consonance with the everyday. This paper seeks to explore the inspiration of divine birth as a form of legitimation for assisted conception. In this way, I wish to ask the following question. How is legalese combined with myth in understanding and positioning contemporary practices embedded in biomedicine? Since 2008, the draft ART's regulation bill has been part of public conversations primarily because it is the only form of recognizable quasi-legal regulation governing the use of assisted reproductive technologies and commercial surrogacy. The bill has had a 2010 avatar, which was circulated for public debates and discussions. Further, the draft 2013 ART bill, 2010 ART Assisted Reproductive Technologies, necessitated a parallel process of mobilizing a wider response, particularly because this proposed legislation will be the first of its kind in South Asia and is a step forward in checking the untrammeled commercialization of ARTs. Although the Bill 2013 acknowledged the importance and significance of ethical practices in the context of ART services, in the present form, the bill is inadequate in protecting and safeguarding the rights and health of women going for IVF techniques, recruited as surrogates, and children born through commercial surrogacy. It also lacks setting the standards for medical practice and completely ignored the regulation of third-party agents who play a pivotal role in arranging surrogates, such as surrogacy agents, tourism operators, and surrogacy home operators and clinicians. I'm not going into the details of this because that is not the scope of, but we can pick it up in Q&A. The 2014 bill, which was recently opened to the public at a meeting convened by the National Commission of Women, Government of India, brings forth a different set of considerations that deal with ideas of access and legitimacy, which I analyze in this paper, are deeply linked to the conversation between myth and contemporary ethical medical practice. In this paper, I look at the myth of the birth of Krishna as one that is most often invoked in conversations on ARTs by representatives of the ICMR and other IVF specialists. Here I analyze the myth in relation to a recent lecture given by the ICMR Secretary, Dr. R.S. Sharma, who is in charge of the draft bill at the opening of a new embryology unit here in Manipal University. I draw from his PowerPoint, which is available online for public dissemination, and elements of his lecture to understand how the myth is used to understand the contemporary. I also suggest that the invocation of this myth in particular is to seek legitimacy for commercial surrogacy rather than assisted reproductive technologies through the particular channelizing of ideas of the womb and motherhood. Let us begin by looking at the Krishna myth. My source for the myth is Wendy Doniger's reading of the myth, which appears in her book, Hindu Myths. Okay. Vishnu is asked to come to earth to relieve her of the burdens of man's evil ways. Here the evil incarnate is Kamsa. Vishnu makes way for his entry on earth. This is a very basic rendering. Makes way for his entry on earth in a new avatar. In the process, Vishnu tells Narada about the prophecy of Kamsa's death by the 8th child of his cousin Devaki, which is promptly relayed by Narada to Kamsa, because that's exactly what he does. Vasudev, Devaki's husband, convinces Kamsa to spare her life in return for each of the children she'll bear. Kamsa imprisons Devaki and Vasudev in anticipation of the birth of future children who he intends to kill. Vishnu seeks out Kali and the 6 embryos of Asuras embedded in the subterranean depths of hell by asking them to fulfill their destiny in the birth of Krishna. Each of the 6 Asuras are born to Devaki, and Kamsa kills them by throwing the newborns, dashing them against a stone. The 7th and 8th embryos become the important nodes of the birth of divinity. Thus, the 7th embryo in the form of Balaram or Samskarasana suffers a miscarriage in Devaki's womb, but is miraculously transported into Rohini's womb without the knowledge of Kamsa. The latter is told that the 7th birth was a miscarriage. The 8th birth is where Kali plays a big role. She takes her place in the cowherd's wife, Yashoda's womb, and is born at the same time as Krishna to Devaki. I'm sorry, it may seem confusing for those of you who do not know Krishna's birth myth, but basically I'll explain it. She takes her place in the cowherd's wife's, Yashoda's womb, and is born at the same time as Krishna to Devaki. The infants are replaced by Vasudev through divine intervention, such as, and this is seen in popular myth, the opening of the gates of the palace prison miraculously. There are no guards. The river becomes silent. There's rain, but it's silent. The covering of the baby in the basket by the Sheshnag into Jashoda's cradle. Jashoda's baby girl is then transported back to Devaki, who pleads with Kamsa to spare her life, as she is only a girl and could do no harm. Kamsa refuses to comply and dashes the baby on the stone, against the stone, at which point Kali manifests herself as the goddess and warns of his impending death at the hands of the one who still lives. Elements of a myth operate at levels of signification that are part of the narrative and elemental at the same time. I use Levi-Strauss's deconstruction of the Oedipus myth to do the same, or attempt to do the same to the Krishna myth. and this deconstruction points towards the way in which the myth-telling also has its own points of discussion and engagement. I endeavor to attempt something similar to understand the outstanding themes that emerge in relation to the birth of Krishna myth. While the diachronic telling of the tale happens from left to right, so Kamsa has a prophecy regarding his death, Vasudeva promises to deliver the babies to Kamsa, Vishnu visits Kali and the 6 demon embryos, again Kamsa kills the first 6 infants and so on. The synchronic themes emerge from top to bottom, so column 1, 2, and 3. Thus, in column 1, death predominates, even in Kali's taking her place in Yashoda's womb, ostensibly to be killed. So it's not apparent at the first reading, but it's underlying. So Kamsa has a prophecy regarding his death. Kamsa kills the first 6 infants, death. Kali takes her place in Yashoda's womb in anticipation of being dashed against the stone. In the third column, the thematic is of birth against odds. So both in Vishnu's plea to the embryos to be born and to Kali to take her place as the 8th child in Devki's womb, and in Kamsa's failed attempt to kill the replaced 8th child, a goddess is born. So basically, when Krishna asks Kali to become the replaced child, and when Kamsa tries to kill Kali, the idea is that in that process itself, she'll resurrect as a goddess. However, it is the second column that creates the linkage in a very interesting way to what happens in the first and third. It deals with transference from death to life and with the thematic of the womb itself. Here I move away from the oppositional approach that Levi-Strauss finds in his retelling of the Oedipus myth. The way Levi-Strauss structurally deconstructs the Oedipus myth actually looks at 2 oppositions of birth, death, and autochthony, which is emergence from the earth. So that's a different telling. Here I take 3 themes and construct it accordingly. Instead, what emerges is the overpowering theme of divine birth that also marks our conversation regarding the referencing of the myth for the purpose of legalese. I do this to actually understand how the Krishna myth operates in its retelling by ICMR, in popular discourse. Here, as I was looking for similar understandings of the use of myth, of mythological characters, and I chanced upon Deepak Mehta's reading of the Babri Masjid as a spectral, disruptive presence in the seamless flow between the Ayodhya Mahatmya of 1875, the text recalling the birth of Rama and its spatial linkages with Ayodhya, and the Allahabad High Court judgment of 2010 regarding the disputed space. It's very interesting how Mehta actually says that even though in the Allahabad High Court judgment and in the statements of the judges regarding the disputed site of Ayodhya, it seems like it's a conversation between the state and the jural deity, Ram Lalla Virajman, which is basically the infant Rama. The Babri Masjid, or the demolished site, operates as a disruptive presence within that linkage. So even though the Ayodhya Mahatmya, the text which tracks the birth of Rama, is used to connect, there is a seamless connection that is being built through the deity, jural deity of Rama as infant. The lack of conversation on the Babri Masjid doesn't mean that it's not present. And it acts as a break in that flow. However, I take that and I say, unlike that, here, the womb, the garbha, operates as a connecting link between the first and the second column. It's the idea of the transference and the process of transference of the eggs of the child that creates this linkage between death and birth. I don't know how successful I am, but we'll see that later. Anyway. Here in the Krishna myth, the second column of transference, asexual procreation and the regeneration of the womb and egg, acts as a link between the 2 other thematics of death and birth. In that sense, the act of passing the embryo and the exchange of Krishna with Kali become keynotes in the resurrection and retelling of the myth to create linkages within the ICMR draft myth. This is a slide straight out of R.S. Sharma's presentation, ICMR Secretary R.S. Sharma's presentation, which he's shown this, he's reproduced the slide everywhere. I don't know whether to laugh or to cry, but for purposes here, I'm using, please focus on the arrows and how the birth is being recreated in a medical, in a sense that is recreating the garbha, the womb. Okay. So in recent conversations regarding the ART's bill, the state is keen on restricting access to commercial surrogacy in India to Indian married couples and to overseas citizens of India, persons of Indian origins and others, purportedly excluding foreign couples who made up a bulk of those coming into access surrogacy in India. When justifying these exclusions, the chairperson of the National Commission of Women mentioned that Indian wombs were not for hiring. They were not available for use by foreigners. The rhetoric centered on and invoked the idea of a national womb that cannot be outsourced to Westerners. I suggest that the invocation of the Krishna birth myth and the particular use of the above imagery by ICMR representative R.S. Sharma at public lectures harks back to a form of resurrection of the mythic womb garbha that is uniquely Indian and thus counter to Western technology. This is particularly provocative because the use of the myth and the imagery does not counter the Western technology or imagery, but aims to provide a foil to it by suggesting that the Indian womb has already been conceptualized in the form of a carrier since mythic times. Initially, such an imagery was meant to seek out Western clientele for the growing commercial surrogacy industry, but is now effectively and conveniently being used to channelize the ideas circulating as part of a state rhetoric that deems Indian wombs as national. So the 2014 bill is very particular about not letting foreign, first it was not allowing gay couples to access surrogacy. Now it's not allowing, not letting foreign couples access surrogacy. So you are identifying Indians, people of Indian origin, overseas citizens of India, non-resident Indians, and people who are married to Indians. In a very interesting identification of who can and who cannot access the national womb. I return therefore to our rendering of the Krishna myth and to column 2 that links the thematic of death and birth in the first and second columns. The transfer of eggs to wombs in a retelling of IVF surrogacy is both different and in keeping with modern conceptualizations of asexual reproduction, different from other forms of renderings of surrogacy myths in other religious traditions such as in the Bible. In the Bible, Rachel, there is a surrogacy. Rachel tells her husband to sleep with the maid. There is sex involved. If you look at the diagram, a very rough representation, everything is flying. Sex is really not the main text. It's this divine asexual reproduction that is being sold, literally. The resemblance with the process of IVF surrogacy is the USP of the Krishna myth. In that sense, column 2 is about the garbh, the womb, fetus, and pregnancy. Garbh in Sanskrit means all three: womb, fetus, pregnancy, child, all rolled into one. The garbh becomes more than the woman and her womb. It becomes an entity in itself. The womb is a symbol, therefore, of regeneration and a site for divine birth. In Amrita Pandey's study of surrogates and surrogacy in India, the Krishna myth is invoked to different ends by the surrogate, the clinician, and the surrogacy agent. The myth is evoked to justify commercial surrogate work, to train and indoctrinate surrogates into believing that they're carrying out God's work, and to justify one's role as God's messenger. Interestingly, at some point, the Krishna myth morphs into the idea of Sarodev or Sarodevta, a mythic conception of surrogacy as God himself, represented often through the imagery of the clinician. The other end of this form of spirituality is seen in the articulation by foreign couples of a form of philanthropic work that they are undertaking to help poor third world women survive. Most of the couples Pandey interviewed, and many of the couples I also interviewed, foreign couples, actually saw this as a good deed more than anything else. So the initial discourse which is prevalent in the West of telling the surrogate that she's doing a favor for the couple for whom she's carrying the child is completely inversed in India. Here it becomes a double bind for the surrogate because she's supposed to be grateful that she has been given access to be a surrogate. Therefore, the Sarodev, she must worship Sarodev. And the foreign couple is made to believe that they're doing her a favor rather than taking a child from her. They are giving her money, setting her up, giving her a life that she never had. In that sense, Pandey notes that mythological narratives are collapsed within a quasi-religious ethic to invert the sense of obligatory gift-giving relationship that is invoked in surrogacy arrangements abroad, in which the surrogate is closer to God and giving a gift to the couple rather than the other way around. In case of the Indian surrogate, she is caught in a double bind of being obligated rather than obligating through the act of being chosen to be a surrogate, which is a privilege that makes her dependent on the philanthropy of the clinician and the foreign couple. On the other hand, I suggest that in opposition to the surrogate, the clinicians and the couples, the ICMR uses the myth to justify laws to regulate surrogacy, often in opposition to its practice in reality. In the speech given by Arish Sharma, private fertility clinics were lambasted for their unethical practices, something that was antithetical to an enterprise which is divine in its very foundations. The practice that led to the birth of gods and goddesses now unfortunately is marked by insidious practices of bloated success rates and unscrupulous doctors. Thus, the ICMR wishes to also provide a justification of its guidelines that restricts access to heterosexual married Indian couples by marking the foreign other as alien and usurping their attempt at civilizational philanthropy. It goes with telling the doctors that you're doing something wrong and therefore we are here to correct it, because this is a process which is divine in its orientation and its origin. Thus, to quote, Clause 11A in the ART's Bill 2014 says, surrogacy for foreigners in India shall not be allowed, but surrogacy shall be permissible to overseas citizens of India, OCIs, people of Indian origin, PIOs, non-resident Indians, NRIs, and foreigners married to an Indian citizen. Legal regulation, therefore, intends to bring back an unlawful practice to the realm of ethics and justice. In that sense, modern institutions such as courts will mediate to rein in aberrant modernity such as IVF clinics through an invocation of the divine. This form of reasoning is especially potent when played out in front of a medical audience of doctors, physicians, etc., which is exactly what Modi does when he invokes Ganesh and Karna. He does it at the opening of a hospital in Mumbai. The Krishna myth comes to occupy an important counter-narrative to the largely negative reports on commercial surrogacy that positions it as a form of exploitative practice. The ICMR uses the myth to give it legitimacy in more ways than just legal. It is meant to help create alternative discourses emerging from within the medical community in seeking to legalize surrogacy. This includes restricting access to certain constituencies who will understand and uphold its mythic underpinnings, such as NRIs and OCIs. Pandering to the Indian diaspora means feeding back the traditional mythic India to them, which is uncolonized and pristine in its birth myths. In that sense, a refashioning of the self for non-resident Indians would mean seeking to contract a surrogacy back home than anywhere else. It is an opportunity for them to gain access and draw from cultures and practices that are built in a glorious Hindu past, where the womb or garbha too is so pure that it holds the divine itself. There cannot be a better advertisement for commercial surrogacy in India. The ways in which divinity comes to mark engagements with medical technologies in India are especially important in what Aditya Bharadwaj identifies as a form of engagement with the self in the face of Western innovations and interventions. In such situations, cultural symbols and myths become the rallying cry for traditions in the face of too much modernity and of the refashioning of the self. Thus, to offset the recurring and often unpredictable failure that IVF throws up, the IVF clinicians seek divine intervention. The clinician does not claim to be God as much as seek the divine's blessings and convey the same to his patients to be able to seek their sympathy and support. This is completely different from the way the divine is invoked in the surrogacy arrangement. These are ART IVF clinicians who are very unsure of the technology they're using and whether it will be successful or not. So you're constantly telling your patient, pray to God, that you may become pregnant. When the embryo transfer happens, you are praying, you're invoking the God. So the clinician does not claim to be God as much as seek the divine's blessings and convey the same to his patients to be able to seek their sympathy and support. And also to suggest that ultimately the act of procreation is assisted and therefore may not mirror the natural act. Nature and its vicissitudes then come to belong to the sphere of the divine. Contrary to the imagined space of Western scientific rationality, this process becomes a form of enactment that involves channelizing a greater power for legitimacy and help. Bharadwaj finds this an interesting way by which the traditional and modern divide is dealt with. I'm quoting Bharadwaj here. This process of juxtaposing traditional self with the modern other is best understood in terms of what Veena Das calls the double entrenchment of tradition in India. She argues that tradition is entrenched, first, in institutions that may be considered traditional, such as caste or religion, and second, in institutions that may be considered modern, such as the bureaucracy and the law. She further argues that an untainted traditional telos is as unavailable in contemporary Indian society as a modern institution, such as a law court. To this, we can now add the IVF clinics, which has not been colored by its location. It is this double articulation which makes institutions such as caste or the religious community into new original entities. This is not a matter of aggregation by which new features are added to old ones. When, for instance, Gandhi used satyagraha as a form of non-violent resistance to British Raj, he transformed a traditional concept into a new concept. So is that what the ICMR attempts in its public conversations on ARTs and surrogacy? The fashioning of a Western technology on an Indian ethic. R.S. Sharma, and I quote him here from his public lecture, says, long before the downfall of the Western civilization, the desire for motherhood was prevalent. We were pioneers in ethics, much before we were the pioneer of ethics, much before the West was the pioneer of ethics. Unfortunately, the Western civilization is now teaching us ethics. This quote points towards the way in which the discourse regarding the West and us continues to mark engagements with reproductive technologies. Which is why the reification of myths that mark our pioneering and early involvement in reproductive technologies. However, what is of interest is the way in which this is achieved through a pointed discourse on one particular aspect of the ARTs, which has garnered much attention even within conversation on ARTs, which is commercial surrogacy. The IVF medical fraternity is already sold on an ideology that positions themselves as demigods, nowhere more in evidence than in the readings undertaken by Bharadwaj and Pandey. This Pandey mentions, contrary to what Bharadwaj finds, that the owner-clinician of the fertility clinic in Anand, where she undertakes fieldwork on surrogacy, likens herself to Mother Teresa, a missionary of God who seeks to provide children to the childless and empowerment to the poor surrogate. Bharadwaj, however, mentions how God comes to embody rational explanation or the absence of the same in clinical practice in IVF clinics. These form of, and he calls this clinical theodicies that transform clinical practice into an act of faith and charity are not absent in other cultures. Elizabeth Roberts, for instance, finds similar negotiations amongst Ecuadorian IVF specialists seeking divine intervention when an embryo transfer is being conducted. This is why ARTs are recognized as assisted reproductive technologies rather than artificial reproductive technologies. The notion of assisting nature marks the engagement with reproduction and reproductive technologies. Here, I again read out an excerpt from the speech by R.S. Sharma. All creatures are there to pass on the genetic traits that they have to the next generation. Nature has given the provision to all creatures to pass on these genetic traits through the act of reproduction. Thus, reproduction is very, very important. According to Indian Vedic literature, there are 4 pillars of society for a good and happy life. And these are the images that follow that. And they are dharma, duty, artha, money, kama, sex, moksha, without which you won't get happiness in life. Reproduction is important for happiness in life, but things change. We all live in the lap of nature, and since the birth of women, we have been in the beneficial aspect of nature. But the act of trying to control nature has resulted in a change in our lifestyle, which has resulted in disorder, disease, etc. And to me, one form of this is infertility. We have created a problem by changing our environment and our lifestyle. This lecture accompanies these 2 images accompany the lecture. The collapsing of ancient Vedic times to nature and its subsequent idolization informs the discourse on ARTs in India. Thus, the bill makes it clear that asexual reproduction may be against nature, but facilitates the practice and preponderance of nature. In such a conceptualization, motherhood is marked as a natural desire. This desire, which is natural, has been curtailed through unnatural man-made intrusions into lifestyle choices and can only be restored through the process of IVF. So again, R.S. Sharma says, the science that deals with molecules, RNA, DNA, etc., points towards the fact that the instinct of motherhood is a physiological phenomena. Please look to the slide on the right. And it's deep-rooted in all women. All young women want to carry the baby of the man she loves the most. So this phenomena is a universal phenomena. The question comes as to why do you need the children? All creatures are there to pass on the genetic traits that they have to the next generation. nature has given the provision to all creatures to pass on these genetic traits through the act of reproduction. Thus, reproduction is very, very important. This is being continuously repeated and emphasized. Reproduction and genes combine to be physiologically manifest through motherhood. In this, a different form of legitimacy is channelized, one that seeks to invoke technology to restore and reify nature in its original and pristine form. And once again, the Krishna myth evokes asexual reproduction, one that is predestined through prophecy more than through sexual relations, to give legitimacy to reproductive technologies. Just like Vishnu was born in Krishna's avatar to restore nature and her natural order, ARTs are positioned similarly as restorers of the natural order, one that is now reduced to impotency and infertility. ARTs are now mythic technologies that were sought to restore divine order lost through wars and mankind's sins. For the ICMR, the control and regulation of ARTs thus positions the technology at a mythic level, and its practitioners as demigods, messengers. The elements that the technology manipulates, such as the body and women's reproductive rights, or who can or cannot reproduce, is secondary to the installation and fulfillment of the mythic quality of such technologies. In that sense, the conversation regarding Krishna's adoption exchange with Yashoda seems unnecessary and not part of the conversation. If you look at this, there is a straight arrow going to Krishna. There is an arrow which is split showing Balram because there was an embryo transfer involved, but Krishna was born and then exchanged. So technically, there was no artificial assisted reproductive technology involved, mythic assisted reproductive technology involved. In that sense, the conversation regarding Krishna's adoption exchange with Yashoda seems unnecessary and not part of conversations. It is almost as though Balram's birth is Krishna's. But the story of embryos is actually a story of technology in modern contemporary India, which is why clinical theodicies in case of ARTs in India also operate as legal theodicies, used to understand, legitimize, and formulate practices that are not only controversial, but involve the conflict of the other and the self at the very basic level. This is similar to the ways in which Sri Ram Lalla Virajman, or the infant Rama, comes to occupy the position of a jural deity in the Allahabad High Court decision around the disputed property of Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. In the conceptualization of the jural deity, thus, time and space collapse in a form of endlessness that negates the existence of the mosque. Here, the name of Rama becomes an important linguistic signifier to seek legitimacy and self-fashioning by rejecting the existence of the other, the mosque and the Muslim, through the text of Ayodhya Mahatmya. And similarly, the myth of Krishna is invoked to other those unable to procreate and not eligible to do so, such as foreigners, through the image of the timeless womb. However, the Garbha comes to life only through technology that is Indian in its preservation of nature and its structures in opposition to a debilitating Western lifestyle. I end this paper with a quote by Mukul Kesavan on Modi's referencing of myths and modern nation-building narratives. He says, "Ordinary human beings are incapable of subverting nature unless they're helped along by godly powers. The miraculous is in the domain of divine grace or religious magic."